Welcome to her tool belt and thanks for watching. I can't believe we're at week 4 of the big build-off competition and I have put off this tabletop for as long as I can possibly wait. A few years ago, I was walking around New York City with some friends and we went to this eclectic furniture shop where they had this entire corner of wood encased in epoxy furniture. These pieces of furniture were so unique and it was really inspiring to see what they did with the wood and the epoxy. And I've wanted to try something along that lines ever since. When planning out this table, I wanted to give a real wow factor to the tabletop. I thought it'd be really neat to do a pattern wood top that's encased in epoxy that you could see through. And with Mass Epoxy being the sponsor this week, there was no better time to try this unique furniture technique. But then I've been waffling to myself these last 3 weeks. Oh, this is a charity table. What if the family hates it? What if I completely mess up because I'm not an expert at epoxy? And what if it just looks dumb? But I finally decided to buck up and just try it. But I do have the backup plan in the corner of the garage. So wish me luck this week and hopefully everything turns out.
The center of the tabletop will be a walnut herringbone pattern encased in the clear epoxy. To accent the dark walnut brown, I'm going to add some blonde maple highlights. The maple highlights will go on the herringbone and embedded into the side of the tabletop. I'm using the pin nailer to hold the maple in place. You won't be able to see the pins once assembled. Once the pieces dried, I ran them through the planer. Then use the crosscut sled to trim them flush. I used the Dremel with a wire brush to remove any bark or dirt in the open cracks. To avoid bubbles in the epoxy, I'm using penetrating epoxy in all the cracks and the crevices to seal them from producing air bubbles. While the herringbone pieces dry, it's time to build a form for the epoxy pour. I have an old piece of 1/2 inch melamine that I wanted to use up for this. The form is a little over 60 inches long and 24 inches wide. Then I put 2-inch sides on it. I didn't know if the epoxy would stick to the melamine, so I lined the form with Tyvek tape. I carefully placed the Tyvek tape in the corners first before applying to the bottom. I left some 1/4 inch gaps in the tape because I'm going to attempt to superglue the herringbone pieces down, avoiding clamps on every piece of wood. I cut little 1/4 inch scrap wood spacers to space out the wood. I put a few dots of superglue on the exposed melamine and pressed the wood down. I'll be using Moss Deep Pour Epoxy. It is a 3-to-1 mix. Then I slowly mix it with a paddle bit and drill. The epoxy gets poured into the gaps and cracks. Then I use a squeegee to spread it around. I like the deep pour epoxy, it's thin and easy to move around. A heat gun is used to pop any bubbles. While the epoxy cured, I think some of the epoxy soaked into the wood and some seeped under the herringbone wood, so the grout lines ended up just below the top surface of the wood. Time to pry off the form. The superglue method worked pretty good. There were 3 boards I thought might be floating, so I clamped them down during the cure. I trimmed the excess epoxy and created a straight edge with the table saw. Then used epoxy to bond the center herringbone to the side walnut pieces. The end clamps are just to get an even height to support the boards. Once cured, I mounted the Rockler circle jig base to the underside of the table. The jig is for up to a 52-inch diameter, so I made a little extender to get it to 60 inches. Then used a straight bit. I went about 3/16 of an inch deep with each pass. To make the tabletop look chunky, I'm adding a second layer of wood around the underside of the table. I used epoxy to bond wherever there was epoxy, otherwise I just use wood glue. All hand clamps were on deck for this effort. I mounted the circle jig base up on a 3/4 inch spacer and trimmed the new boards into a circle. Now to cut the groove for the maple highlights. I used a rabbet bit, then measured the height and depth. The depth is just under 3/8 of an inch, so I'll cut 1/8 inch thick strips of maple to fill the groove. The 1/8 inch will allow me to easily bend and follow the curve of the table. On the first and second rows, I use wood glue and pin nails to hold the maple in place. For the third row, I use wood glue and all the clamps again. And I probably could have used about 10 more. Then we're back to the router and trim bits to make everything flush. The top of my center section is lower than the top of my wood sides because the center boards were plain more, so I need to fill it with more epoxy. I ran a perimeter of tape around the tabletop and covered the table with masked tabletop epoxy. The tabletop epoxy is a 1:1 and quite a bit thicker than the deep pour, but it seemed to cure faster than the deep pour too. Once it dried, I added a nice chamfered edge and another coat of epoxy. It's looking pretty sweet. What do you think? Thanks again for watching, and please subscribe, and you can check out more of the big build-off videos in this playlist. See you next time for the final reveal.